Radio Free Santa Clarita presents The Talk of Santa Clarita, a podcast about issues involving Santa Clarita and the surrounding valley. With your host, Stephen Daniels. Episode 161, a special conversation with Christy Smith. Part 1, the announcement. And now, let's see what the Talk of Santa Clarita is.
And remember, this is for posterity, so be honest.
Christy Smith, welcome to the Talk of Santa Clarita, and literally in the lair of Talk of Santa Clarita.
I know, right in the belly of the beast where all the action happens, right?
Yeah. My garage.
Yeah, hey, you know what?
But you know what's exciting about this is I can get a load of laundry done while we're doing this.
Absolutely, multitasking is the thing.
And maybe you can help me with the garbage later. So.
Okay, cool. I'd rather fold laundry.
I do want to give the precursor that today is garbage day. Literally, we may have to pause for a moment for the garbage truck to come
Understood.
by. So I just give that warning to the audience as well. So first off, how you been holding up with COVID? Just in general, I mean,
yeah,
life.
you know, doing okay. We can't complain. My husband was able to transition his job responsibilities. I wrapped up in Sacramento, and so being at home, you know, has kind of been a good thing for me. Mm-hmm. My youngest was home for a little while, home from San Diego State because they weren't having classes in person. She's now gone back down, and my oldest daughter lives at home. So you know, it's been okay for us. So we've focused on some of the kind of
but
community
have you gotten a little stir
things.
crazy? I mean, seeing the same faces every day and no one else. Kind of
yeah, you know, I think we all really, you took for granted how much we were out and about in the world, right? Like to the point where we coveted that time at home. Like, well, I'd just like some downtime on the couch to watch a little Netflix. And now it's like, wow, I really miss, you know, just being able to go to a movie on a Friday night, or
I miss that.
Yeah,
I miss live concerts quite a bit too.
Yeah, and live music.
Because I finished Netflix.
Right.
Not the queue.
Right.
Netflix.
Good for. I feel like I finished HGTV. I'm about like, okay, I have seen this same house three times.
So you can build a house now.
Yeah.
So I just well, you actually. You have an announcement. That's why you're here today.
Right.
So do you want to give me an announcement?
Right. Well, I'm really happy to be here with you because you've kind of been along for this whole crazy ride. But I do plan to run for Congress again in 2022 for whatever number this congressional seat ends up being.
Yes.
You know, anticipating that given the geography that Mike Garcia will be my opponent.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So, I mean, what is it possible he might not be, or?
It would be highly unlikely. They'd really have to draw some weird lines in the district for that to happen.
Well, don't put it past anybody, you know, when it comes to gerrymandering and everything else.
Well, we don't gerrymander here in California. I mean, we've got a nonpartisan citizens redistricting committee. And, yeah, they do a really good job, just based strictly on demographic data with community input. It's a very open process. That's how it should be. Yeah,
you know, nationwide.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is why we got to worry about the House majority, right? Because there are states across this country. I mean, looking at you, Georgia, Kentucky, some of these other places where, you know, you've got districts that, you know, look like the route to grandma's house in a bad snowstorm, right?
The Daily Show did a bit about literally talking about gerrymandering and about how the districts are drawn. There was literally one district where you could cross the street and cross into another district and then cross the street again and be in another district or back in the same district because it like shaped like a, you know, like a peninsula or something like that.
Right.
It's just weird.
And, yeah, we just don't do that here in California. It's based on population and keeping communities of common interest together and maximizing the voting potential of our minority class voters. You know, if you know, we want to keep Latino voters where they can put a candidate forward if they'd like to, and so on. And so, and I think now more than ever, and especially here in California, as diverse as we are, that's incredibly important.
Tell me about the decision to run again.
Yeah.
How did you go about doing it? I mean, first of all, I'm curious about what it's like to well, to be very blunt, lose.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, particularly by what is 333 votes. I mean, that's so close.
Yeah.
Did you cry? Did you get angry? What tell me about the
emotions. I mean, look, as my mom used to say, adversity builds character. First time I ran for school board, it was an at-large election, was new to it. didn't quite get there. Same with my bid 2016 for state assembly, and then in 2018 was successful. This was an uphill. This was always going to be an uphill climb all the way in both the special and the general. Fighting during a global pandemic, when I was doing a full-time job as a state legislator role, I took really seriously. That took a good amount of my time, and so basically I was doing 2 full-time jobs, had a lot of incredible support from really great people to help me do that. But and it's a presidential year. Always harder to run in a presidential year in so many respects, because there was a lot of noise around that, right? Especially given that this was the Trump-Biden contest. And so we always knew it would be close. Didn't really cry. I mean, definitely took about a good month to just kind of
I would have cried.
Resettle. I think the hard part for me, and I couldn't get to the decision to go forward and do this again if I couldn't have gotten past some of the resentments of the last cycle. Like that article, I literally just a few minutes ago sent you that article about how disingenuous the GOP was in flipping these 4 California House seats, right? That they were just persistently on this mission to distort the truth, to distort not only my background, but Gil Cisneros, Harley Ruda, needing to work past that. But we just have this fantastic group of activists here in this district and all over Southern California who care about this district so much and have been so invested. So I never really got any downtime. Folks were just calling to check in. How are you? How are you doing? What's next for you? And but I personally needed to get to the point where I had that same fighting spirit, the willingness to run the kind of boots on the ground campaign that I know it's going to take, and still do that gut check that this isn't just for me it's never about the winning. It's about doing the job.
Yeah.
And the job and the work is what I love to do. So that makes the fight worth it.
You don't enjoy the campaigning as much, do you?
I do not enjoy the campaigning as much. And frankly, I would if we were kind of in this environment where everybody committed to, hey, we're going to sit down, we're going to have a climate debate, and we're going to have, a criminal justice reform debate, and we're going to have an immigrant rights debate. But we don't. The last cycle was very much about people using misinformation and trying to define frames that weren't important. We weren't talking about issues in the last cycle.
Anybody that watched Hulu seemed to think that you were just notorious for raising your salary and firing teachers, none of which was true.
None of which was true. The most I ever made as a school board member was about $275, $285 a month as a stipend, and you get the stipend to cover like gas expenses, part of doing the job. And in my case, my kids were young enough then that they occasionally needed a babysitter, so that's how I paid my babysitting fees to be able to do that job. Did not ever lay off a teacher. Where we were required to give notices in the spring, which we did, and then we worked so hard and so diligently through our budget process to be able to rehire all those teachers.
Well, how do you feel when you see that distortion of truth? I mean, I don't want to say lie per se, but there is a certain. I mean, it's definitely a not complete truth.
Right. They have to have a nugget in there to be able to get it on the air, and we definitely had lawyers vetting all of it, but it is a gross distortion of fact. Here's my biggest problem with it, Stephen. It's wrong when either side does it, because we have such a problem in this country with people having faith in the institutions of our government. Congressional approval is at an all-time low. State legislative approval is at an all-time low. Most people have a pretty good feeling about like their local school board member, occasionally their city council member, but people's faith and trust in government is shot. And it's because they are constantly lied to, and they don't see any results that really materially impact their lives. Now, the positive thing about that is like right now in these first several weeks of the Biden administration, I feel like we're getting there, right?
Yeah.
We're seeing a turnaround in COVID. People are seeing, money in their bank account as part of this recovery package. But we do a disservice every election cycle when we are not talking about issues. We're not talking about how we're going to materially improve people's lives, that we're a stand-up responsible person, and what we're going to do for them right here in their backyard.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because to me that explains Trump in a lot of ways, because he kept talking about draining the swamp, because people are fed up with government in general, and they wanted to believe that this guy coming in with no ties, that it was independent, supposedly independently rich, wouldn't have any obligations except to do the good for the people. Conversely, it's like if you ever really watched Trump campaign, he would promise you everything, but never tell you how he was going to do it.
Right. No, and I'm sure his industries did quite well. I mean, he got a lot of money through his hotels and his golf courses, because those were his, venues that he chose to do his work from. But, really, governance is about what you do when you're either in Washington, D.C. or Sacramento. Sure. The legislative piece is a big part of it, but how accountable you are, how accessible you are when you're at home in the district is every bit as important.
So first off, the first election was a special election. So that you were kind of thrust into that in a lot of ways. Almost like, I mean, there was no chance to really plan for it. There was no, you were working full time. It was, and your opponent, Mike Garcia, had been running for almost a year. He had taken a leave of absence from his job. Had financed a lot of this campaign himself. So he was pretty free to do what he wanted to do and what he needed to do. I imagine that made it very difficult to try and do a full campaign.
Those were certainly the challenges, and the special happened. So February, March of last year is when we started the pandemic precautions. Right. And so my team, and for our part, Democratic Party in this state and across the country, took that very seriously. We were following public health guidance, and we didn't knock on doors. We did very, very early on, in probably the first several weeks before shutdown orders came into effect, and then we chose not to. Like, we weren't going to put anyone's life at risk. So all those things considered, my highest priority was doing a good job at my day job, right? I had to connect constituents to resources. I had to be present and making good decisions in Sacramento to help steer this ship of state here, to keep us on solid footing, to help our public health officials have the resources that they need to combat the pandemic. And then on the heels of kind of someone else's crisis, which is never easy to step into. And statistics show, if you're the successor candidate trying to fill the shoes of someone who is left under whatever kind of cloud, that you take some hits, you take some points.
There were some, in a weird way, there was also the fact that you're a woman, as the previous candidate was, and a blonde woman on top of it. The comparisons.
And very often, even back in 2018, folks couldn't tell us apart. Which, that's fine. I get that people aren't studying in that great a level of detail. But it was challenging for sure, the special. And Democrats, we don't often do well in specials. Those are lower turnout elections for us, which brings up this great subject that we're seeing all across the headlines after what happened in Georgia yesterday of
you're talking about the
voter suppression, right? I think the Republicans' biggest fear right now is that we maximize Democratic voter participation. And when you make it really easy for people to vote, the turnout goes up. And so we are really having this very important big national conversation right now, and as President Biden so rightly pointed out, it is un-American to talk about limiting voter rights. Every election we have, whether it's a special, a general, a local municipal election, we've got to make it as easy as possible for people to vote. If you're somebody working 9 to 5 or you're somebody working a couple of jobs, you should absolutely have access to an easy mail-in ballot so that you're not standing online for a couple of hours to wait to have your voice heard.
It's interesting, too, the Republicans for years were campaigning for mail-in votes, but then as soon as it flipped to a situation where it looked like Democrats are going to have greater success with mail-in, they suddenly have a problem with it. Do you have, I'm curious about a campaign on the size of this is. First of all, how much money do you have to raise to win, or to actually be competitive in this?
In the millions. In the millions. In the millions, for sure, at a minimum. And so it's a lofty goal, and I do it without corporate money. I don't take corporate PAC money. I don't take lobbyist money. So this is all individual donors. I was really pleased in the last cycle to have had over 200,000 unique individual donors to the campaign, people from all over the country, lots of folks in California who care very much about us having this seat. And a lot of those folks have, stayed on board and active. So, but it's a challenge. That's why I'm such a huge supporter of H.R. 1, right? We've got to get a grip on the voting rights bill, campaign finance reform. We've got to get a handle on all of this. This is the people's government, and we need to put it back in their hands.
Do you have a specific strategy? It seems to me, again, a campaign this size, it seems like you have to go, okay, here's how we're going to win. This is what we're going to do. And kudos to you for getting into a special election like you did, kind of being thrust into it. But I almost wonder if you were able to even focus on a strategy because it was so quick that you were suddenly running for this race.
Yeah, I mean, there's some parts of strategy that are traditional that you're always going to do, right? So you're always going to send mail to people's houses. You're going to try to end up in the newspaper with good stories about things that you care about and what your positions are. You're going to have television and digital advertising.
Right.
To your point earlier, though, on digital, I mean, the hits from them were just relentless, and we could have spent twice as much money as we did in digital trying to answer that, especially at a time when everyone was home during the pandemic consuming media across all platforms. It wasn't just television. People were on Hulu, people were streaming their Netflix and what have you. So the ability to elevate our game on that platform is really important. But then, taking away what is our stronghold, which is, knocking doors. And we know the other side was doing it. We know they set up those fake ballot boxes. We know that they...
It struck me as fascinating that they complained about ballot harvesting in 2018. And then filed a lawsuit, the Republican Party out here, with the governor for ballot harvesting.
Yeah.
Yet Mike Garcia openly said, yes, we don't support ballot harvesting. He said on this podcast that he had a problem with ballot harvesting, and then he went out and did it.
Yeah.
He said he was doing it.
Right.
Right. The hypocrisy there just astounds me.
Yeah, and it's it's one of those things that I think the right has put that moniker on it, the harvesting, right, which sounds like organ harvesting or some awful thing. And really the intent of it was, again, expanding the franchise, making it easier for people to vote. So if you're a housebound person, your neighbor could take your ballot in for you if you sign the back, right? You could have somebody that you're affiliated with come by, pick up that ballot from you. And it even could be an official organization that's tasked with maximizing the vote, a nonprofit organization, right? Could go knocking on doors and just saying, hey, we noticed you hadn't submitted your ballot yet. Can we help you out with that? The intention is not nefarious. All we're asking is that more people's voices be heard through their ballot being submitted. There is no abuse there. There's no fraud there. It's getting a ballot from point A to the point where it gets counted.
Well, that's what the right says, is that they're concerned about voter fraud. That thousands of illegal or undocumented immigrants are voting.
It is just not the case. I can tell you now, having been a candidate through several cycles with Los Angeles County and Ventura County, these officials at the county level that are tasked with this, vote counting, vote certification, are completely diligent in their work, very above board. The employees take it seriously. The support staff they bring in to help get this done take it very seriously. And it was so close between Mike and myself that at the end, when we were really down to like this finite, 0.01% of a difference, every ballot was being looked at by hand by attorneys from his team, by attorneys from my team. There is no doubt in my mind that wasn't handled completely above board. And when there were challenges, maybe someone's signature didn't quite match on the envelope, those are ballots that can be what's called cured. So the county reaches out. They provide both campaigns with access to which ballots those are. So if we choose to reach out to that voter and ask if they'd like to have their ballot redone, they may sign an affidavit, get that to the county. There is so much effort placed on every ballot being valued and counted that can and should be counted. And when there are questions, it's set aside. And if that question can't be resolved, that ballot isn't counted. I mean, so this notion, this big lie that we are now predicating, taking people's voting rights away from them because of, it simply isn't true. The cases of voter fraud have been so infinitesimal compared to the greater benefit of everybody having greater access to vote. And it's really, over 250 bills across the United States right now aimed at limiting voters' rights and voters' access based on what is essentially a lie.
Because they don't like the way the election went.
Well, they don't like the way the election went, then, change course, right? There was several, I believe it was after the second Obama cycle, the GOP did this big post-mortem analysis of where they were headed. Michael Steele was, the head of, and they said basically we've got to reach out to minority voters more. We've got to change things about our platform and our agenda. And then literally in this last cycle, they had no platform at their own convention, right? They were not running on issues. In the meantime, Democrats have got so many issues, right? You can't fit us all in a room because like everyone's coming to the table with the issue that they want to work on, whether it's climate or healthcare or, justice reform or women's rights or pay equity. We have more issues than we know what to do with, but that's why we do government, right?
Right.
It's not to win for the sake of winning and having that power.
Do you think when you talk about running, one of the things you mentioned to me was, and I'll just for full disclosure, we tried to do this podcast a couple of days ago.
And almost ended up landing on a witch in the land of Oz.
We picked a day. We were going to do it outside, as we've done a couple of others, and literally picked a day that the weather was supposed to be 75 and sunny, and it was like 50 degrees, and the wind was about to. I swear to God, I think I saw a house flying around and Surrender Dorothy. Right. But so to your credit, you went through it, you stuck through it, and did the podcast. It just none of it was salvageable. So, but we talked a little bit about one of the things you mentioned was the DCCC was kind of upset with you doing my show. Do they try and? I mean, how much influence do they have on a campaign?
Well, it's not so much they were upset with me doing the show. One of the things, and given the way that the GOP behaves, and we saw that, they will take a clip out of context and use it to what they think is their advantage. And there was a statement that I made on that podcast that they tried to do that with. Now, of course, they took me, speaking in full thoughts and full sentences and dissected probably about 7-10 words, what have you, and try to make hay of it. And that is something that is hard to get used to as a candidate who's like I like a full conversation, right? So I don't speak in sound bites. I like to really let people know my full thought process. And I think that's why we see so many candidates kind of be a little more introspective and kind of very limited in their presentation of things, because we now always have to be worried about what the other side is going to do with well-intentioned information that they decide they can edit.
I honestly, I think that might be one reason Mike Garcia won't come on the show anymore, because he did say flat out that he didn't believe in a social safety net, and the DCCC picked up on that and ran crazy.
Ran with it.
And it was interesting, about 4 months out, he spoke very honestly, as far as what his views were when he did the show, but about 4 months later, he started very much talking typical GOP talking points, and very brief sound bites and stuff like that. It was like, as soon as it looked like he was going to be the nominee for the GOP, it's almost like somebody got to him.
right. And so to me, that's the really hard balance and the hard trade-off, though. It was like we were talking about before with the disinformation. At the same time, when you're only talking in talking points, you don't give people enough to go on, right? It just sounds like a bunch of airy, lofty promises. And if you don't talk through what the challenges are, how we're going to get there, how we're going to pay for it. Like, we never talk in government circles anymore about how we're going to pay for things, right? We just say, that's a great idea. But it's not sufficient, right? People need to know that you have some legitimate ability to actually govern. And the way that you do that is in having like more full, robust conversations.
I wanted to, you consider yourself a wonk, right?
I'm a big policy nerd.
You're a little bit of a nerd when it comes to that.
No, I had, I'm on the Delta Stewardship Council yesterday, and we did there's this new report on climate change and its impact, and we did about 15 minutes on water cycle and its impact statewide. Big piece of it was on what it's doing to salmon migration, and we're going to have less salmon to eat. And I'm like, I'm in my happy place, right? Because these incredible scientists all over California have gathered this data. And it's hard data to hear because we're not in a good place, but yes, and if you are someone who is a lifelong learner, this is an ideal career because you get to study everything.
Yeah, it's not for me. Because the thing is, every time I think I brought this up before. You have the record for the most most appearances on this show. Yeah. So for that, I want to thank you.
Thank you for having me.
But most of the time we talk policy, or we fight, one of the two.
Right.
But I want to talk a little bit about you growing up.
Yeah.
A little bit about you as a person, and just kind of get to know you. I'm curious what you were like as a child.
Really shy.
Really shy?
Really shy. Involved in stuff. So my mom wanted me to be involved. She thought that would help draw me out. So I was born in Würzburg, Germany, on an army base. My dad was in the service during Vietnam. stationed overseas. And so when I was about 6 months old, the folks moved home, and home for them was Indiana. So we lived there until I was 10 in 1979, and then my dad got a job opportunity in California. So, 0 to 10, just kind of typical kid. But
what part of Indiana?
So Fortville, outside of Indianapolis, and then Terre Haute, which Steve Martin has this whole comedy routine on, which is pretty funny. My grandparents were in Noblesville. So it was, kind of that traditional Midwestern, church on Sundays, wear gloves on Easter kind of, so I have just enough of that Midwestern sensibility in me that I've retained. But then we moved to California when I was 10, and it really was such an eye-opening, I think, incredible experience. I'm glad my dad decided to make the move. It was great for my mom. She was able to go back to school because our community colleges are so affordable here, and get her nursing degree. And I kind of blossomed and came out of my shell and started taking on, just a lot more opportunities and chances and being outgoing. On the one hand, it was a challenge because of what did happen in my family. I've spoken publicly about the fact that there was, stress and domestic abuse, and that kind of escalated for sure once we were in California.
I don't know anything about this.
So, I think different era in terms of mental health, and definitely the approach to mental health, and coming from the Midwest, my parents' approach to it, a little bit different for my mom once she got into nursing school. But my dad struggled with demons just for a long time, and my parents had a very tumultuous relationship that sadly sometimes resulted in my dad being physical. I can remember, bruises on my mom's face. I can remember times when, one time in particular, he got upset with me and lofted a dining room chair and kind of threw it, didn't hit me, but threw it over me. And, on the one hand, it was scary and traumatic for any children who grow up in that kind of environment. On the other hand, I just kept pushing through. So I think a fair amount of my backbone and my tenacity comes from the fact that I had to be a little more independent.
Did he ever come to terms with his demons?
He did. So much later in life, he actually had a full breakdown at one point, and started getting therapy and help and anger management and medication for some of the other issues. Apologized to my mom. But it was a challenging time.
It had to have been, just because, just thinking about, you see what your father's doing, and the anger that he has, and you're kind of walking on eggshells, I assume, on some level. You want to love him, but at the same time, if he's being physical with your mother, or if he's throwing a chair, it's hard to love him, isn't it?
It is, and I think that's the trauma that most children in those situations grow up with, right? You just have this kind of push-pull relationship, and we had made amends by the time I lost him a couple of years ago. Was there at the end for him, and it was easier once he acknowledged it, right? Once he admitted that it was a problem, and he was regretful and remorseful. That made it a lot easier for me to move on, because there's some part in every child too that they blame themselves, right? So I was definitely one of those kids who externally I wanted to do all the things that made the family look good, right? So I got the good grades, and I was in student government, and I was a cheerleader, and I did all those things that to the outward facing community here made it look like everything was fine.
Right, sure. Why do you think you came out of your shell when you came here? What was it about California?
The opportunities, the diversity, the diversity of activities, the diversity of people, the fact that I was in a classroom and not everyone was the same color as me. I thought that was so cool, right? Like, growing up in Indiana, hadn't been exposed to a lot of that, to international cultures or foods, right? Yeah, because you have that same experience.
From Kentucky, I can remember when I was in college when I came out here, but just being intrigued with someone who had an English accent. You know what I mean? Talking to somebody in person, it was such a common thing for someone to have an accent from a different place, where you would only be exposed to it on television or in the movies when you grow up in the Midwest or in Kentucky or in the South or whatever. It's a very different world. And people of color and just the whole thing. It's a whole different world.
It's a whole different world and different perspective, and I think that was so incredible for me. And there's growth that happens through change when you embrace it. So moving to a brand new place and being in a new school, and just learning to go along and get along in a new place is challenging. I mean, I think that's what you see, like children who have been in military families and they're so resilient, right? Because they've had that experience.
I think it's always, remember the actors, the actors studio with James Lipton. He would always ask these successful people, about their history, and it was almost always that the parents were divorced or military families.
Yeah,
it seemed like a common factor, just because the military family, because they were moving around a lot, there was a force to be independent and strong and literally come out of your shell in a certain sense.
Yeah. And I had to work from a very early age when my folks split up. I had started babysitting to have money when I was like 12 and didn't stop working after that, right? My mom needed me to be responsible for some of my own expenses, and so I did, stepped into that. But it teaches you appreciation of a hard day's work. I've scrubbed dishes, I've slung pizzas at Chuck E. Cheese, I've put on the outfit and done the birthday parties at Chuck E. Cheese, had kids pulling on my tail. So I mean, I think it has given me a greater, appreciation for hard work and knowing what that's like, knowing what it's like to open a refrigerator and there's half a jar of jelly and just the heels of the bread, because that's where mom's at in terms of her paycheck cycle. And so, you make do.
Tell me what made you interested in government in general. I mean, you've kind of always wanted to be a politician.
Always wanted to be. I am a patriot through and through. So I can remember in Indiana, it was the 1776, so the bicentennial, and I just happened to have like this prairie girl dress because I was in one of my cousin's weddings, and our Girl Scouts were doing something for this bicentennial parade that was going to be in downtown Fortville, Indiana, and we had built a float, but there was only room on the float for a couple of girls, so all our names went in a coffee can, and you draw the name out. My name got drawn to sit on this float for 1776, and you would have thought that I was like Princess Patriot, because I was just thrilled. We've got a picture of me holding the flag, and I just and growing up in Girl Scouts in the Midwest, and even here in California, right? I love this country, but I love this country. And I love our Constitution, which you first learn about in about 5th grade, because it's built literally to be expansive. It's built to take us where we need to go, if we use it right. If we use it as the right kind of tool, and we think about changes and amendments that are meaningful and powerful, and really maximizing the potential of our government system. And I love the work. I love helping people, and I think I've said to you before, my motto is leadership is the practice of making others successful. And if the tools at your disposal are whatever government you're serving in and the resources you can bring to bear there and your relationships that you have in the community, that's good work for me. That's meaningful work. And I'm so, especially now during this crisis, so mindful and so aware of the fact that not everyone gets to do work that they love, right? A lot of people do the work that puts food on their table and keeps a roof over their family's head, and that is my commitment to them to make sure they can keep doing that.
Why does that appeal to you so much? I mean, not everybody feels a commitment to community service or helping people. Everybody has their own thing, but I mean, where does that desire to help people come from?
I don't know. I mean, you see it, and that, so much of the 2020 cycle, when we couldn't be out knocking on doors, we focused on community service events, right? So we were doing food drives, and we were doing food giveaways, and partnering with other community groups. And there is just, I don't know. I mean, this is the part that makes me cry. I don't know how to put my finger on what it is, but I just know that if I am not being of service, I'm not in the right place. Okay. And there's a lot of ways to do that. But this work and the ability to maximize that on a bigger scale is something that appeals to me, because then my other skill set, right, my critical thinking and my analytical ability, my tenacity, my willingness to push back on people who I disagree with, that's where the legislative piece comes in.
I'm going to bring up the Mohawk again.
Yeah.
Because the reason I bring it up is because I'm so intrigued with it, because first of all, there's no pictures.
Right.
And the second thing is that the assumption from the fact that you were in student government, that you were making good grades and everything like that, is that you wouldn't do something so radical as get a Mohawk.
Right.
You know what I mean? a certain sense that you were the kind of the preppy conservative girl, and in school and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So tell me about the mohawk. What prompted it?
Well, okay, so it was the 80s, and it was kind of like just an edgy. It was like the faux hawk. It was the girl version where the sides are really short and kind of the middle is kind of longer. And I did it one summer in junior high school because it was the 80s and it was cool. And it was cool. Yeah. A huge fan. You and I have talked about our love for music, right? And concerts and stuff. So the few concerts that I was allowed to go to at that age with adult supervision, it was, and my mom, this huge credit to my mom, because she knew the rebellious teenage years were coming. And she's like, if that's the worst you're doing, right? Yeah. If I'm not keeping you from escaping out the window in the middle of the night, and I'm not telling you to, stop using drugs or not drink alcohol or whatever, it's hair. Like, it grows back. So express yourself, have fun, and we'll grow out of it. Which, in fact, I did, because had this super short haircut, made freshman cheer, and needed to have, just a slightly, and it really was only for a couple of months, but had to have slightly more presentable. And the only photo we have, because my mom refused to take photos at the time, even though she let me do it, there were no photos, but 8th grade graduation, and it was like the mod ska movement, remember that?
Yeah.
So the girls had a different version of the attire, but almost everyone wore a hat. So I have this really cool pink mod ska hat with my 8th grade graduation dress, and under that hat is this really short hair. So I decided to grow it out. So from, like all of freshman year, 9th grade, I just had kind of the more Pat Benatar kind of, 80s hair, and then I was over.
You want to stand out a little bit for this race? Maybe get a mohawk now.
I think that would go over very well.
I mean, no one's going to confuse you, though. You would be known as the congressional candidate with the mohawk.
Exactly.
So, Jess Phoenix has a similar.
Jess had, and she had that really cool. I don't remember what event she was at, like.
But you did it before it was cool.
Yeah,
before it was hip.
And she is cool, and she's got a book out now, so I'm really happy for her.
Now, so you growing up, can you tell me about growing up here in Santa Clarita and what it was like?
Yeah. So, I mean, on the one hand, it was hard because of what was going on at home, because Santa Clarita was very much, kind of this family-oriented, family-centered community. Still is. A lot of people move here. It's a great place to raise your family. But I like bucolic. Like, roller skating was big then. It's making a comeback now. But with my best friend, Trudy, we'd put on our roller skates and go from the Valencia Glen neighborhood right around the corner from here and roller skate up to what it is now the closed Rite Aid, but was Thrifty's then. And you used to be able at Thrifty's to get an ice cream, like a cone was 15 cents and every additional scoop was like 10 cents or something like that. So we'd get an ice cream and then skate all the way home. Perfectly safe, great to be out. Mom could say, go out and come back when the street lights come on, right? Yeah. And just the kind of old-fashioned traditional fun, Friday night football, going to Bob's Big Boy after and getting the burger and fries. It was a great time to grow up in the 80s in Santa Clarita. It really was. And so many advantages and opportunities, and adults who really cared about all of us, parents' eyes, everywhere. You didn't get away.
And 30 minutes from Los Angeles.
And 30 minutes from LA if you wanted to go do the cool, edgy thing, like go to a dance club.
Like Valley Girl kind of, see the Clem Souls at a Hollywood club or something.
Exactly, yeah.
Did you party much? Were you a drinker?
No.
Did you smoke pot?
No. My thing was always dancing. Always had a really good time going to dance clubs, going to see live music. Yeah. Have been to the Whiskey, the Rainbow, all those fun things. Yeah. But no, you
never smoked pot ever?
Not till I was a much older adult. And then it was just to say that I could try it, because by then, like, Clinton had been outed and Obama had been outed, and I'm like, well, shoot, I better at least see what it's all about and try it. I'm like, okay, this isn't for me. Yeah. But, it's legal in California now. Yeah, no, I just had fun having fun.
For me, it was always the fact that it was illegal in Kentucky, and I added on to that there's no off button. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's like, you get a little high, and then suddenly you go, okay, well, that's great. Let's get off the ride now. And you can't stop it.
Right.
Yeah. So
well, and the few times I did have alcohol, like, it just doesn't agree with me. And so it's not worth the other.
So you're not a drinker at all?
Occasionally, socially, I like a good margarita. There's a couple of places in town that make a fantastic margarita. Just recently started acquiring a taste for wine. Haven't really ever been a wine fan, so.
Okay. Tell me about your family. How long have you been married?
I've been married 30 years.
30 years.
Yeah,
Impressive.
over 30 years. Yeah. People said it wouldn't last. We met each other at COC. We were in the same class together, a poli-sci class, and we're the two top grades in the class, and so started studying together. And we had our first date in May 12th of 1989, and we were married December 30th of 1989.
That's quick.
It was quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why people say, oh, it'll never last. You'll never make it through the rest of your schooling, and you know, you'll never this and you'll never that, and here we are over 30 years and 2 kids later.
What does Philip do?
He's in financial services.
Financial services. And tell me about your first date.
Oh, it was fun. He went all out. He borrowed a suit. He borrowed a car. Bought theater tickets to see Les Mis. And I didn't think it was a date. I thought we were friends. Like, we're study partners. I'm like, well, this is kind of, okay, this is nice for a friend to do that. And didn't really know how seriously he was taking it until 3 days after our first date was my birthday. And he bought this very beautiful, very tasteful box of chocolates with kind of this perfect card. And I was kind of like, okay, maybe this is, something a little more to him. And then
it's interesting too, because that would be what, the 80s, late 80s or 90s or something like that. That's sweet then. Now it would be considered stalking.
Right. Yeah. No, and he for the week after that, like, he kept making excuses to have to come by and see me. And so this was before Google, and so you did research, like, with actual magazines and books and stuff. And we were working on this project together. He's like, hey, can I swing by and grab those magazines? I'm like, yeah, sure. So yeah, it was cute. And apparently he had told his brother and his good friends before we even went out on our first date that I was the girl he was going to marry.
He just knew.
So he called it. Yeah.
But you didn't know.
I didn't know. No.
When did you know?
When I knew for sure was that day when I showed up. Because I was still like, all right, well, I like him. He's really sweet. He's honest. He's a good guy. I am kind of young. Do I want to go? Do I not want to go? So everyone had left, like, my house. I'm ready for the wedding. My mom, my brothers, everyone's already there. And I'm like, do I do this? And so
oh my God.
I did. I did.
There is and I had similar issues with my wedding. There's a certain kind of like, well, you're going to let all these people down.
Right. Yeah. No. And for me, it wasn't about that. It was about him. I think the people would have been fine. We would have fed them, and they could have gone home. And they would have been fine. But no, for me, it was him, and he's been a rock. And this is not an easy business to be a spouse in. It really isn't, especially with social media the way it is. And he sees the way other men in particular make comments about me, and that it's hard to watch and not engage. Yeah,
sexism is pretty predominant in a lot of the politics in general, it seems. And they, I mentioned the blonde and being a female and running for this office.
Yeah.
There have been a lot of people that have tried to put you in a certain position or make slanderous remarks towards you just based on that. My dog's barking in the background there, just so everybody knows. I'm curious. You got kids? You got 2 kids,
I have 2 daughters.
Okay, and their names are?
Chelsea and Chandler.
And were you a Friends fan? Is that what the?
No. So Chelsea was born in D.C. When my husband and I worked there during the Clinton administration. I had a different name picked out, but Chelsea Clinton was in the, just because of the Clinton family, and my husband kept hearing it, and he just wouldn't remember the name that I had chosen. And so then she was born, and I'm like, we looked at her, I'm like, yeah, Chelsea, it's a beautiful name. Chelsea kind of fits. And so Chelsea it was.
What about Chandler?
Chandler, I said, I'm picking. You don't get to mess this up. And her name suits her too.
Does it? Okay. Yeah. And what do they do? What is
Chelsea's a recent college graduate looking towards heading to grad school soon. It's been a little challenging during COVID to find work. So she's one of those people definitely economically impacted by this. And Chandler is finishing up her senior year of college, and then she's going to pursue a teaching credential and master's.
Good for her. Good for her. And I'm just, oh my gosh. Tell me about some of the concerts you saw.
Oh my gosh. First one was Bow Wow Wow.
You saw Bow Wow Wow?
Oh yeah.
Oh, I bet that was great. Where
concert at Magic Mountain.
Really?
Magic Mountain used to do concerts back in the day. Yeah, I saw Bow Wow Wow there, and Devo. A couple of really good bands came through Magic Mountain. They had a nice concert venue. You had to go early. You had to wait in line, so you had to be there when the park gates open, and then go rush to get in line. I've seen Depeche Mode a couple of times. Adam Ant. Didn't go to see any of the big hair bands. My brother was a musician, and so saw some of his stuff there, which was the smaller venues, Whiskey and Troubadour. But yeah, I'm a huge music fan.
Are you?
Yeah.
And what do you listen to today? I mean,
eclectic. I've got so many playlists going on Spotify. Yeah, everything, classical, show tunes, tracks. I love the Pride Classics playlist. There's everything from disco. I like some country. Huge Dolly Parton fan. Love Dolly Parton. I mean, not only for the human that she is, but have liked her music since I was little.
It's hard not to like Dolly Parton.
Oh yeah, she's great.
And a lot of people don't know this, but you were once a Republican.
I was. For my first presidential election, I was a Republican. Growing up in Santa Clarita, again, late 70s through the late 80s, and it was a different time to be a Republican for sure. And some of the opportunities that I got living here, I think I told you the story once of Cameron Smythe's dad, Clyde, was superintendent of the school district and had this luncheon coming up, and it was Governor Duke Majan, and it was our state senator, our congress member, our assembly member. And he could have taken staff members or colleagues, and chose to take the local student body presidents from each of the high schools so that we could have this opportunity to meet those folks. And so
you went on a date with Cameron's father.
Well, he was gracious enough to let us enjoy that lunch, and it was quite an experience. And that's what really set it in stone for me, that like this is cool work. This is what I want to do. And then still have the Bush Quail T-shirt from a campaign rally that I went to somewhere down in the valley. But that was the last Republican presidential I voted for.
So what happened? What happened for you?
The party continued to move further away from me, particularly on social issues and climate. Well, I'm a women's reproductive freedom. That's a hard, bright line for me. And also, as I began my own career in government service, really started to see a significant and important role for government to play at every level. So while I believe in making sure that we keep reasonable limits on government and a lot of government transparency, there is absolutely a role to play in keeping our infrastructure whole, in providing a social safety net, and in some of the things that I feel like the GOP has continued to walk further and further away from.
It's fascinating to me when someone like Mike Garcia says that the social safety net should be relied on with churches and charities, which was the case before the New Deal. And we had bread lines.
Right.
And when he talks about food stamps or other issues, the SNAP program itself or whatever, it's like, what do you think happens when they can't afford food? What do you think they do?
Right.
When you're desperate, you do anything to feed yourself and your family.
Yeah.
It just creates crime.
Yeah. And the reality is, look, there are people on food stamps who are working poor, who work full-time jobs, who still need to qualify for that assistance, right? There are people in the United States military, sadly and ashamedly, who qualify for food stamps, if they're entry-level military professionals. And that's something we've got to think about, right? We've got to work very hard at raising everyone's wage so that we have fewer people who need those resources, but when they need them, they should be there.
And again,
we are far too wealthy a nation for anyone to go hungry.
Oh, I totally agree. And full disclosure, I was once a food stamp caseworker, and I, everybody talks about fraud and stuff like that. I think I saw fraud maybe 3 or 4 times.
Sure.
The majority of the people that I dealt with, and I did it for over 2 years, it was people that really needed help.
Yeah.
And almost always not on the fault of their own.
Right.
It's just bad luck.
Yeah. It's bad luck, and it's making ends meet. I mean, my mom qualified for Social Security disability at the end of her life, and had worked, paid into it, and had this guilt over it. And I'm just trying to convince her, like, Mom, it is okay. You've paid in. You're retiring a couple of years ahead of where you would have because of this medical condition. But this is why you worked, why you paid in. That is what the social safety net is there for. But can remember times in our life growing up where we were close sometimes to needing assistance. It is expensive to live in this country now, to live up to our responsibilities, to have a roof over the head, to have a car, to insure the car, to put gas in the car, to do all of those things. And with what's happened in the global economy, a lot of Americans have been left behind. And post-recession, there's been recovery, but a lot of that recovery, almost all of it, has been concentrated in wealth at the top. And if you were working poor before the recession, you recovered to working poor. And we've got to change that dynamic.
I mean, how?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have an agenda that works really hard at making sure that our international trade agreements are mindful of the fact that we need to keep manufacturing in America, those skilled manufacturing jobs. We could do a lot in infrastructure investment right now. Super excited to see President Biden's proposal on infrastructure investment. I know so many people across CA25 who are part of trades unions who would benefit greatly from that work. Our economy would benefit greatly from improvements in our freeways and our waterways because of it. And we continue to provide that social safety net. There's absolutely irrefutable evidence that says if people are provided that, if they have the basics, the rest of the self-improvement will come. That's why you see wraparound services being such an important part of the communication now around our unhoused population, right? It's if you provide housing first, get a roof over somebody's head, but make sure you have the wraparound services there with them so they continue to make that transition to be stable and to be able to be self-sustaining. It all works together, but we have to be diligent about it and mindful and to provide people the economic help and support when they need it.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the election last time around.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to ask you a question, and I don't want to. I'm afraid I'm going to sound glib, and I don't mean to. But the first commercial that you did was about your mother not being able to afford insulin.
Yeah.
Horrible story.
Yeah.
Situation there.
Yeah.
I think the garbage truck just showed up. Right
on time.
Right at this emotional moment here.
Yeah.
But one of the things they said was, you know what? Let's pause for just a second.
All right.
And then we'll just come back and we'll cut to the clip of what it was like on with the podcast on Tuesday.
Right. Right. Without the bluster, it's so much easier to concentrate too without the wind. Wind is so discombobulating.
Yeah, but the wind, you had that windblown hair look kind of thing
going. Yeah, had the Beyonce hair going.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah.
I was thinking about setting up a fan here for the look.
Every once in a while on a shoot, we get lucky with
that. Yeah. All right, let's get back to it.
Okay, perfect.
But I don't mean to sound glib.
Yeah.
But a lot of people, the conservatives on Facebook and a couple of other people were making some pretty heartless comments about it in the sense of like your mother, she was lacking insulin, correct?
Right.
And the response was, well, why didn't you pay for it?
Yeah, well, so the same story that I just told you about her feeling like she didn't want to access the additional Social Security benefit that she was entitled to. She was a proud person. And she knew that my brothers and I were still working. I had my oldest had started college, right? There's life is expensive.
Sure.
And she didn't want to reach out and say that she needed the help. And occasionally she was able to get the samples through her physician and she worked it out. Other times she rationed. But here's a person who worked her entire life taking care of us and then being in the healthcare profession herself and got to that point where she couldn't handle it. Super excited to see Katie Porter is taking this on now with the companies that produce insulin. I proudly spoke in support of and voted for a bill in the California state legislature to put caps on what insulin costs. Because people become life dependent on it. Like they do many medications. And globally, internationally, we can look to Canada, we can look to Great Britain, we can look to other countries where they are doing a much better job of getting people the medications they need at a price that they can afford. There is no reason why we can't be doing that here.
All three of my dogs are barking in agreement with you.
Well, because the garbage truck came.
Yeah. No, and again, I don't mean to sound glib about that at all. To me, it was sort of like, I kind of wanted to
and we helped her in other ways that we could, but
she's a proud woman.
She was a proud person.
Yeah,
she was a proud person.
I'll say this: a lot of people are. What do you think about the Affordable Care Act in general?
I think it's good. I think what the additional short-term benefit that President Biden has been able to add in the Recovery Act is incredibly important because a lot more people's premiums are going to be subsidized at a higher level going forward for the next year or so. We need to continue that work. And what we ought to be looking at next is allowing states to have some expansiveness in waivers that they can petition with their Medicaid dollars to see what they can do in their own states to cover everyone. I do believe that everyone should have health care coverage, and the benefits are tremendous. Employers see greater productivity and attendance at work when people just have the access to go to a doctor and, for heaven's sake, get if they need an antibiotic, to get it, to be able to heal and to be better. So many small business owners that I've talked to that just say they'd love to be able to provide for their employees, but they're priced out of that private healthcare market, right? So let's create a public option that small employers can purchase on an exchange, that individuals can purchase on an exchange, that can be subsidized and made available to everybody so that everyone has coverage.
What sold me on the Affordable Care Act was, I have a friend back in Kentucky. I'm going to just name her Melinda Higgins. She doesn't listen to the show, but she's a diabetic. And she talked about when the Affordable Care Act passed, for the first time she was able to get insurance and afford her insulin for the first time ever. Because before she was living off credit cards to buy her insulin.
And she had a pre-existing condition and she couldn't get coverage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I know how much she was struggling to do that. And I look at the people, I'm going to sound glib, but I have yet to meet anybody that complains about the Affordable Care Act that's just complaining because it costs so much, but that aren't already wealthy. You know what I mean? That it seems like, well, okay, yeah, your expenses may have gone up, but you can afford it, right? You may not want to pay it, but you can afford it, right? Yeah. And that's what I'm seeing more and more from it's like, oh, it costs too much, But
well, look, healthcare is taking an ever greater proportion at whatever income level you're at of people's paychecks, and that's something else we've got to look at. Healthcare is the only consumer market that we are forced into blindly as consumers when you think about it, right? Yeah. You get a choice if you have employer-sponsored healthcare, you get a choice. You can choose your HMO, your PPO at whatever level. Yeah. But when you go to use it, when you go to cash it in, that's about whatever deals the hospitals and the providers and the insurer have worked out. So you need a knee replacement surgery, and you try to price compare between two different places because you're trying to do the right thing as a consumer, right? And get it, with someone you trust, but at a rate that seems reasonable. You can't access that information. Even harder, obviously, for people in any kind of an emergency care situation. And so if you are in an emergency and you have gone to a hospital that is outside of your coverage or not provided in your provider network, I mean, it shouldn't be this complicated. So there is a lot more that can be done around transparency, around pricing transparency, around getting prescription drug costs down, all with the goal of sooner, much, much sooner, rather than later, getting everyone coverage, because that's the important thing.
We got to get back to the election itself. I realized we got off on a tangent.
You got into healthcare because you started asking me about that first ad with my mom.
Getting back to the election itself, when you talk about 333 votes, I assume that you literally have nightmares with the numbers are chasing you around. Do you feel like you were too progressive or not progressive enough? I mean, this is a purple district.
Yeah.
How do you run in those terms? Do you try? I mean, I don't know exactly how you approach what your policies are, or you had some challengers that in the primary, the initial primary that were the jungle primary that were arguing that you weren't progressive enough.
Yeah, well, I think that one individual who spent $1 million to get 6% of the vote got about the number of people who really self-identify as extremely progressive in this district, right? We do polling in these things, obviously, and we always ask how people identify and where they are on the spectrum. And it is about that subset of people in this district who identify as progressive. And probably on a good amount of the things that are important to them, I'm there or in the neighborhood with them. The rest, though, are people who aren't there. So they're somewhere between extremely progressive and extremely conservative. And it is one thing to win an election, and it is another thing to govern. And I have always run every campaign as the person that I'm going to be when I'm governing, right? Because if you only campaign to your base, if you campaign to a small subset of voters whose vote you're trying to get for then, but then you're going to pivot and do something entirely different in your votes or the way that you govern, you've misled them, right? So I was running as who I was. the challenge presented by the pandemic, by the fact that we weren't doing multiple debates on issues hosted by nonpartisan, independent folks, right, who would ask those hard policy questions. We didn't talk enough about policy. We talked an awful lot about biography, but we didn't talk about what we were going to do for the people of this district and drawing what that contrast was. It's also really hard to find oxygen in a presidential, right? Everyone was really into the Trump-Biden contest, as they should have been. But, 10,000 more people turned out, voted for President Biden, and then didn't vote the Congressional.
Why not? Why did that happen?
That's where we miss those opportunities, those conversations that we have at the door. And we don't know what they are until we knock on someone's door and we say, who are you supporting for president? They say Biden. We say, great, let's talk about the rest of your ticket. Us very consciously making the choice not to put our volunteers at risk, not to put our voters at risk during the pandemic by not knocking on multiple doors and having people in tight quarters to do training and all of those things. That's kind of the consequence of that.
What are your thoughts about Mike Garcia as a congressman?
Not happy with his voting record. Certainly, you talked about the 333 votes. It never did it weigh more heavily on me than on January 6th.
Yeah.
When he voted to not certify the election after kind of, soft pedaling the language around that day, fight like it's 1776, and some of those references that are very much on his media, which he tries to walk back from now.
Which seem to be QAnon. I mean, very subtle QAnon.
Yeah, right. It's kind of the wink and the nod to the folks in that space. That was a very heavy weight. But then subsequent votes, voting against infrastructure, voting against the domestic violence bill, the Violence Against Women Act.
How do you vote against domestic violence?
Well, that's that was my question. Is there is no conservative principle, right? You can't call yourselves the party of law and order, and then not be willing to put some parameters around what that means for violence against women. Just please don't spare me we're the law and order party.
I think his argument was about the Second Amendment and the limitations on people that have been convicted of domestic violence not being able to buy guns.
Well, let me tell you, having lived through that, again, and prefacing with I had made amends with my dad, but there were some of those interactions between my mom and my dad that I can remember growing up where if there had been a gun in the house, it might have been a really different and really tragic outcome. Because people do things in the heat of a moment in situations like that. And absolutely, if someone has committed an act of violence against a partner, same-sex partner, domestic partner, spouse, they should not have access to a gun.
My wife is a member of Moms Demand Action, and one of the things that I've noticed is that there are statistics that state that there's almost a correlation between people that have committed domestic violence acts and these people that to go out and do these mass murders later. That they've almost always been convicted or been known to do domestic violence of some sort. So, I mean, there's definitely an argument for limiting the gun rights of. And perhaps it doesn't have to be for that person's lifetime, but certainly until they have sought some help and there are clear indications that the behavior has changed. What do you think about red flag warnings, just out of curiosity, with the guns?
Also important.
You believe in the red flag warnings?
And we need much better data tracking and processing in this country, right? We are not backing up even the laws that are on the books, so we need to do better about that.
Mike voted against the stimulus package.
He did.
Complaining about only 9% going to COVID. Is that accurate?
No. And here's one of my big concerns about him is that I don't think he understands the difference between taking a position and what actual governance involves, right? A lot of what was in that package is capital investment for all the different healthcare institutions, government institutions, and agencies that have been tasked with dealing with this crisis for over a year, in addition to helping employers and small businesses and individuals recover, right? We need to stimulate the economy as a result of this dip that we've taken because of the crisis. We need people to have money to go now in the next couple of weeks as things open up and support their local favorite restaurant or concert venue or whatever it is. And governments, city councils, county governments, school districts, especially school districts, who have shelled out resources either to make distance learning possible. Many school districts were not ready for that, ready for hotspots and technology and equipment for their kids and their students, and had to stand it up so quick. and now have to transition back into their brick and mortar buildings, making sure that the ventilation is up to code, making sure that they've got enough protective equipment for their teachers, that they've got enough custodial staff and supplies to really be sanitizing those classrooms until we can get kids vaccinated. So, there's just a lot that goes into managing a crisis that is incredibly expensive.
It helps keep jobs. I mean, right? I mean,
and you want to talk about cost savings. Hey, you know what? Let's support Trump's big tax plan, which ended up skyrocketing, the national debt. But now, heaven forbid, when we actually need to help all Americans, all people, we can't afford that.
Well, it strikes me as funny that a lot of the Republicans loved, the big talking point right now is the Keystone Pipeline being stopped by Biden and being a job killer.
Right.
But, voting no against the stimulus package, when the stimulus package itself, when they talk about only 9% supposedly going to the COVID vaccine stuff, but everything else that you're talking about is basically jobs.
Yeah.
It's like you're killing jobs by voting against that in a certain sense.
Right. And all infrastructure is jobs.
Yeah.
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 Which redounds into income tax being paid and people having more money to spend in their local economy. So that's sales tax. People having some economic security, so they're not, needing to access public safety net programs. I mean, think about it. It's pretty basic economic stuff.
So I'm going to ask you a question here. The first is, I'm really enjoying our conversation here, and I have a lot more to talk to you about. So how much time do I have with you?
As much as you need.
As much as you need? Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to turn this into 2 parts.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you one more question. We'll end this for tonight, and then we'll pick it up with part 2 the next day.
Okay.
So, you talked about a little bit about January 6th and Mike Garcia voting to not certify two of the states. Would you consider him a seditionist?
Look, I'm not going to put that label on it, but what I'm going to say is everybody who was part of that conversation, either who voted not to certify, who had anything on their social media, wink and nod, whatever it was, but had a problem with every state that worked so hard and so diligently to make sure that everybody could vote in a presidential contest in the middle of a pandemic. For all of those court cases brought by the Trump administration and others in the GOP that were overturned time and again because the evidence of fraud or mismanagement or malfeasance simply wasn't there, you do a disservice to the American public, and all you are doing is now feeding this narrative that's driving, drawing back voting rights.
Yeah.
It is un-American.
The argument that a lot of the right will say is, well, Maxine Waters and a couple others challenged in the 2000 election, the 2004 election. Yeah. Is it the same thing?
No, because we didn't have a president who had said from even before he was elected that if he hadn't won, it was rigged, and then said throughout in the run-up to Election Day that it was rigged. You were part of, if you chose to go that route, you were part of that larger national narrative that was a piece of that. That was a very deliberate attempt for him, first of all, to sow distrust. And now that same distrust that is being capitalized on by the movements on the right who want to restrict voting rights and voting access. And that is not where we need to be as a country.
It's interesting, too, that in the cases in 2000 and 2004, it was a question of whether all the votes had been counted. And in this case, it was about trying to shut down votes.
Yeah, shut down votes from being counted, and even votes that were recounted, like in Georgia, where they, those teams and Republican-led public officials, diligently recounted and hand counted and made sure that every possible vote that could have been considered valid was included, in those numbers. Okay. That's the way it should be, and that is the faith that all Americans need to have and should have in the system. And God bless those officials on both sides of the aisle that took that work that seriously and will continue to do so.
Okay, so we're going to end right now and tell everybody to tune in tomorrow because we'll pick up literally right up from where we started here.
Perfect.
So okay, and by the way, we're not changing clothes. So tune in tomorrow. Two-parter.
You've been listening to The Talk of Santa Clarita. Listen to us on iTunes, SoundCloud.com, YouTube, and Stitcher. Barring a life event getting in the way, a new podcast is available every Tuesday. Questions, comments, and show ideas can be sent to thetalkofsantaclarita@gmail.com. You can also call or text us at 661-505-8672. That's 661-505-8672. Follow us on Twitter at The Talk of SC or on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at The Talk of Santa Clarita. You can also visit our website by going to www.thetalkofsantaclarita.com. This has been a production of Radio Free Santa Clarita Incorporated, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. To donate, go to radiofreesantaclarita.org/donate. Radio Free Santa Clarita, on the net and on the air, and we're very much aware.
Any questions?